I'm Jonathan Romain. I'm the former rabbi of Maidenhead Synagogue, and now I'm convener of the Reform Beit Din. You might need your pocket calculators because, as some of you will know, Reform Judaism started in 1840, but the Reform Beit Din didn't start till 1948. So that's what, 108 years? It's quite astonishing. Did not have a Beit Din for the first century of the Reform movement. So what happened was that essentially it was a DIY. Each synagogue looked after its own converts, and that was that. What changed was the arrival of an American rabbi, Harold Reinhardt, in 1927, in fact. He came to West London. He came from the States, where, of course, reform was much larger. Every synagogue did its own thing. He regarded that as complete anarchy. And as the reform movement here in Britain was growing, he decided we shouldn't go the same way and we should have a central Beit Din. So that's when we started, 1948, all thanks to Harold Reinhardt. The motto of the court is a mixture of standards, but also looking after individuals. This is perhaps one of the, as a big generalization, differences between us and the Orthodox. The Orthodox will probably put rules first. We try and put people first, but within a structure. If you asked a Dayan, one of the people at the Orthodox Beit Din, what the purpose was, they would probably say it's to apply Jewish law. The founder of the Reform Beit Din, or the first convener rather, a Rabbi Michael Curtis said, what's the purpose of the Reform Beit Din? It's to help people. So quite a different perspective, whether it's applying Jewish law or helping people, hopefully doing both, but with slightly different emphasis. And actually, the Beit Din is important not just for the individuals who come before it, but for the movements as a whole. It's actually one of the unifying factors, one of only two unifying factors. We are in Reform Judaism an autonomous movement. Every synagogue can do its own thing, however bizarre. But the two things that unite us are firstly the prayer book. We all have the same siddur. We're all doing the same thing roughly on a Friday night, but also the Beit Din. So the conversion standards and procedures are exactly the same, whether it's in Kehilat Kerno in Cornwall or in Newcastle or anywhere in between. And it's changed a lot. It's a dynamic and ever-changing, because although we have some rules, and I'll go through them in a second, we've changed enormously over the years. Some of you may have witnessed them. For instance, for many years, there were a lot of people, women, who really weren't interested in converting, but they wanted to do so for the sake of their children and the husband. And we realized there was no point forcing people to convert against their will with sham conversions, so we had a new procedure whereby if the woman went through a Introduction to Judaism course, but didn't convert herself, nevertheless, her children could be Jewish. And that way we didn't force people to have a false conversion, but we did allow the children to be brought up and become Jewish. In fact, we took that a stage further just only 2 or 3 years ago, whereby we changed from being the matrilineal line, in other words, going through the mother, but status was if you had either a Jewish father or a Jewish mother. In other words, you could be Jewish if you had one Jewish parent. And although some people howled at the time, saying that's not traditional, actually matrilineal wasn't traditional. Because if you think about the Bible, it was patrilineal. It didn't matter that Joseph married an Egyptian priest's daughter, his children were Jewish, and we bless our children on a Friday night, Ephraim and Manasseh, by them. It didn't matter that Moses married a Midianite priest's daughter, Zipporah, his children were Jewish. And it was patrilineal more or less until the 8th century BC, switched to matrilineal, and now we've gone perhaps the next step of making it equilineal, either which way. COVID changed things. It meant that a lot of people couldn't come to synagogues. Therefore, we started introducing distance learning, and which, curiously enough, has become even more important because there's a lot of people who want to convert who aren't near a synagogue or who are not able to travel to the synagogue for whatever reason. And so we also have distance learning. You still have to get involved in communal life, but there is this option. And we've seen a massive change in what's been happening to conversions in the last 2 years. Whereas beforehand, once upon a time, you would say that 90% of people who came to the Beit Din were people who either were about to marry somebody Jewish or had already married somebody Jewish. In other words, they wanted to unify the family. We're getting an enormous amount of people who convert what's called lishma, in other words, just by themselves. They are single. Or sometimes they even have a non-Jewish partner. And the reason why this has happened is, I think, although you may have other theories, of a sort of almost perfect storm of three things happening. Firstly, COVID, which meant a lot of people were looking for meaning, looking for religion. They went online, some went to Buddhism, some went to Islam, but others went to Judaism. Secondly, DNA. A lot of people are starting doing DNA tests. They're not necessarily looking to be Jewish, but I know they might think they've got a pirate from the Caribbean in their background. But to their surprise, great surprise, they often find there is Jewish ancestry. And for some people, that's just, well, it's a fact. Other people want to pursue it. Or maybe it resonates. They've always felt something, I don't know, attractive about Judaism. They've always, I don't know, just felt at home with Jewish people. And so they decide to pursue that ancestral link that they discovered by chance. And the third factor, after COVID and DNA, is schools. About 20 years ago, 30 years ago, many schools started doing multi-faith RE, so not just Christianity, but other faiths too. And initially, a lot of it was Judaism, and still is. And a lot of kids really enjoy going to synagogue. They like the taste of the challah and the Paul wines wine. They found the midrashim told by the rabbis interesting, fun. And now, when they're in their 30s or 40s, and they're looking for maybe something spiritual, they remember that really nice experience in their childhood, and they decide to convert. And we're getting a lot of people who said, I was interested in Judaism from school when I was 8 or 9. Obviously, they didn't convert then, but now they wish to do so. So this has changed the sort of the type of people converting, as I said, from family reasons to just their own. As for what happens when you do convert, well, as you would imagine, it's usually a minimum of a year's course to see the year go round. Involves study, service attendance, being involved in the community, and also personal integrity. That's important too. Where the knowledge covers the ABC of Judaism. We don't expect people to be professors of Hebrew or theology, but just to be able to join in basic Jewish life, whether it's at home or at synagogue. But it does include Hebrew reading, and when you go to the Beit Din, you may well be asked to read something in Hebrew. Circumcision for males, and also whether male or female, there's mikveh, so the dunking in the water. The idea being that, for a year or more, it's all been cerebral, it's been up here, you've been thinking, studying, reading. Judaism involves the whole of you, the whole of your body, and therefore immersing yourself in the water signifies that change. If there is a Jewish partner, then very often we ask the Jewish partner to come along to the classes too, partly to be supportive, but also because, and you may know people in this situation, a lot of born Jews stop their Jewish education at 13, going around permanently with a sort of spotty teenager's view of Judaism, whereas the convert is learning as a mature, sophisticated adult and actually ends up knowing more than the born Jew. And we find that a lot of the born Jews at the end of the course say, no, I really enjoyed that. I wasn't looking forward to it, but now that I've done it, I really grew as a result. And it means also they become more involved in the community. If there's a non-Jewish partner, well, for a start, they have to agree to the person converting, because the last thing we want to do is to have somebody convert at the cost of their marriage. So they have to sign a letter saying that they consent to their partner becoming Jewish, and if possible, they come along. If not to all the classes, certainly some events, communal seder, goodness knows what, because we don't want them to feel a stranger in their new family. What happens when you come to the court, the Beit Din, is it's a conversation. People always think of it as an examination. It's actually a chat with the rabbis. We sort of assume that if you're coming to the Beit Din, you will probably pass, simply because it is the job of the sponsoring rabbi, the local rabbi of your community, to have made sure you've covered the syllabus, you've got involved, and so forth. And the Beit Din's role is partly to have a chat, check everything is okay, because one or two things sometimes get through the system wrongly. Also, just to check that the person is happy converting, hasn't been being put under any pressure. And some of the questions could be factual questions, like who was Rashi or what's the next festival. Others more about sort of their spiritual journey and what made them interested in Judaism, how their attitude to Judaism has changed over the years. To answer a question you may be thinking of, do people get turned away? Occasionally, very rarely, because as I said, it's the sponsoring rabbi's job to prepare them properly. But the Beit Din has once or twice certainly in my memory, actually turn somebody away. What's more common is if someone is, I don't know, really, really down on their Jewish knowledge and it obviously hasn't prepared properly, then we might say, well, look, come back in 3 or 4 months. We would also, by the way, tell off the sponsoring rabbi because they shouldn't have sent the person to the Beit Din in the first place. Of course, the Beit Din isn't just about conversion. It's also about other things as well, such as adoption, and also divorce. And certainly the Reform Beit Din, we ask for a get after divorce. But again, that's changed because, as you may know, a get is written in Hebrew, sorry, in Aramaic, and is then torn up. Uh, it is very expensive because it's handwritten on parchment. And we've now got what we think is a cheaper and more egalitarian get, which is in Hebrew. It's printed on paper, a bit like the Ketubah is printed, and at least people can understand what it says, whereas Aramaic, frankly, nobody does. So we have sort of developed a get, and that's only been in the last year, a Hebrew get. We also have a shtar. Shtar means document, and this is when, because the get should be granted mutually. Technically, it's not the Beit Din that divorces a couple. They divorce each other, just like they marry each other on their own free will. But sometimes one partner will refuse. And whereas that is a big problem in the Orthodox community, where the man can refuse to give over the get, and then there's nothing the rabbis can do about it, we say, well, look, if they're already civilly divorced, then there's no reason why the religious divorce shouldn't proceed, other than malice or maybe financial gain. And therefore, if usually the husband refuses, despite being contacted and despite being asked 3 times, then we will award a get over the husband, over the head of the husband, and authorize it from the court and free up the woman and stop what we call the aguna problem, the problem of someone who's chained. I'll just end by mentioning the differences between myself and between the Reform and the Liberals, but Rabbi Solomon's will elucidate more. He and I met actually about a year ago when sort of merger talks were on the horizon. It's not a done deal that Reform and Liberal Beit Dins will merge. It's one of those things under discussion. But we looked at the differences between them, and Rabbi Solomon drew up a fantastic grid of all the things that they do and all the things that we do, and we compared them side by side. And we were quite taken aback by how little differences there are. And I guess that applies to the movement as a whole, which is precisely why they've merged in the first place. Perhaps one of the differences in the Liberals is that they will demand or ask for an essay being written by the person converting, and whereas mikveh is obligatory for us, it's optional for them. And also they don't, but again, Rabbi Solomon will go into this, have a get, whereas they have something else called Sefer Kurutut, a document of separation, which is sort of a little bit similar to the new Hebrew get that we have introduced. But whatever the issues that there are yet to sort of chat over and reconcile, it's worth noting that for many, many years, I'm talking about 20, 30, 40, Reform synagogues have always recognized liberal conversions. Conversely, liberal synagogues have always recognized Reform conversions. In other words, we have what used to be called the gentleman's agreement that we would respect each other's decisions. And therefore, we've already sort of had situations where we've, despite the differences, overcome them. Plus, of course, every synagogue, as I intimated earlier, are autonomous, and therefore a synagogue can always say, well, we'd like this person to do this or do that if they want to become full members. So synagogues are, at the end of the day, the backstop to whatever else is going on. But certainly it's been a real pleasure working with Rabbi Solomon, and that's something I'm looking forward to continuing in the coming months. And having said that, I think it's probably time for me to hand over to him.
Oh, thank you very much, Jonathan, and thanks for those kind words. Hi, I'm Rabbi Mark Solomon. As well as being the chair of the Beit Din of Liberal Judaism, which is a very part-time unpaid role currently. I'm also a senior lecturer at Leo Beck College and the part-time rabbi of the Edinburgh and Leicester liberal communities. I've been chair of the Liberal Beit Din for something approaching 7 years, I think now. And for much, if not all of that time, I've also had an associate chair in Rabbi Dr. Margaret Jacobi, formerly of Birmingham Progressive Synagogue. Part of that's because I simply physically can't chair all the Beit Din sessions, so I needed somebody else to do that regularly when I couldn't. But it's also great to work in partnership with another rabbi, and it's good to have the gender balance of having one male and one female rabbi leading the Beit Din. So as well as chairing the Beit Din on the days when we convene, the other main role of the chair of the Beit Din, or as we've been calling it more recently, Rosh Beit Din, head of the Beit Din, in liberal Judaism, is fielding inquiries from rabbis and others throughout the movement about matters of conversion and of Jewish status, and coming up with answers and solutions for cases which may at some point come to the Beit Din, but that's usually long in the future at the point where we offer a way forward in some slightly complicated case. Jonathan has already very ably delineated a few of the main differences between the liberal and reform approach, but I'll say a little bit more about that. Broadly, I don't need to repeat what the mission of the Beit Din is, because I think Rabbi Romain has expressed very well on behalf of both our movements what the Beit Din is there for, to help people to be a portal, a way in to Judaism, not a gate that's designed to keep people out, but a welcoming space to enable people to enter in if they're properly prepared and qualified, and also give them an appropriately deep and perhaps a little bit spiritual experience at the time. So coming to the Beit Din itself is a profoundly important rite of passage for converts or people seeking recognition of their Jewish status. I'll say a little bit first about the issue of patrilineal Jewish status, because I know this is something of great interest. Some of you may know that I came from a background 30-something years ago as an Orthodox rabbi, and in Orthodox Judaism, only children of Jewish mothers are accepted as Jewish. Otherwise, anyone who didn't have a Jewish mother has to go through a conversion process, including someone with a Jewish father. That's what I grew up with, and it was something that is almost taken for granted as part of the Jewish way of doing things, both in the Jewish world and in the wider world as well. So one of the most difficult things for me to get my head around when I became a liberal rabbi at West Central Liberal Synagogue, 1992, was liberal Judaism's policy about patrilineal Jews. And this is something that had gone back quite some years. I don't know when liberal Judaism formally began accepting people with Jewish fathers and some degree of Jewish upbringing as Jewish and recognizing them as Jewish without the need for a formal conversion. But it certainly goes back at least to the 1980s. I think in practice it might have gone back a little bit earlier than that as well, but possibly wasn't written down quite so officially. But in the early 1980s, Rabbi Alexander Schindler, who was the head of the American Reform movement, was very keen to make this an official policy of American Reform Judaism. And I think it was at that time that liberal Judaism as well adopted this policy. It wasn't simply a result of internal developments among the rabbis. There were also people within the movement pushing for that. And there was a remarkable woman scholar called Evelyn Wilcox, who wrote a book which was never published, unfortunately, a very good book called The Half Jew in the Synagogue, which outlined the plight of people who may have Jewish family names, may have been brought up being treated as Jewish, being thought of as Jewish by the outside world, but rejected by the synagogue, by the Jewish community. And she did a lot of research on this. She herself was in that position of being a patrilineal Jew. And I met her when I began working at Leo Baeck College. And we had wonderful discussions together. I read her book and I was deeply moved by what I thought was an issue of justice. And so I became deeply committed to the justice and the fairness of treating people with Jewish mothers and Jewish fathers equally. So that is, in fact, the policy in liberal Judaism. It's not just that we accept people with Jewish fathers and some degree of Jewish upbringing and identification as Jews. It's the same rule for people with Jewish mothers. So in that respect, we can actually, ironically, be stricter than the Orthodox. Because in Orthodox Judaism, in principle, anyone with a Jewish mother, even if they were brought up in a completely different religion with no Jewish experience whatsoever, as long as they can prove their maternal Jewish ancestry, they're accepted as Jews without any further process. Whereas in liberal Judaism, our rule is we treat people equally. So just as someone with a Jewish father may need to show that they had early Jewish experiences, some kind of Jewish education, even if informal, and I really identify as Jewish, feel Jewish, and we accept them as such. The same applies to someone with a Jewish mother. We don't automatically accept them. In principle, they also have that sort of balancing decision about their upbringing as well. And so I think it's a little bit different in the Reform movement and in other parts of the world, but that's the principle in liberal Judaism. We try to maintain a real sense of gender equality, and that applies both to people seeking affirmation of their Jewish status, also on our Beit Din. I think it might be the Reform policy as well, but we strive always to have a gender balance among the rabbis on the Beit Din. So it's not all men or all women sitting, but a balance. Jonathan said a word about the get procedure for Reform Judaism, and that we have something slightly different. Historically, the principle in liberal Judaism regarding divorce is that a civil divorce was always regarded as absolutely sufficient to end a marriage, even if it was a synagogue marriage, and nothing further needed to be done religiously to bring the marriage to the end. But the late Rabbi John Rayner, who was for many years the leading intellectual rabbinic figure in liberal Judaism, was not really comfortable with that historic liberal approach. He felt that we'd gone too far in abandoning any progressive involvement in the Jewish divorce procedure. So after studying the matter for many years, he instituted the Sefer Keritut, the biblical phrase used in the book of Deuteronomy, a book of severing, which is a sort of divorce document, which is not a traditional get, which was issued unilaterally by the husband divorcing the wife. I know that Reform Judaism does not treat it in that unilateral way, but in liberal Judaism, we treat it as an optional document for people who feel that they want a religious closure to their religious marriage. And if only one of the partners is interested in that or prepared to cooperate with it, then we can do that unilaterally for one partner, even if the other refuses or doesn't want to be involved. It doesn't have to come to the Beit Din. The congregational rabbi can help a couple with that as a sort of pastoral act of bringing a religious closure to their marriage. But it's certainly not a prerequisite for remarriage in liberal Judaism. And I think that's something that the liberal rabbis all feel pretty unanimous about. Another slight difference, coming back to people seeking affirmation of Jewish status, is that when the movement for Reform Judaism instituted their current practice of inherited status, that is, recognizing patrilineal Jews with some Jewish upbringing as Jewish, the way that's been instituted is, and Jonathan can comment or correct me if I get it wrong, is that it's done within the synagogue by the congregational rabbi, and the Beit Din simply signs off on it. Whereas in liberal Judaism, our practice for many, many years has been that someone seeking affirmation of their Jewish status does appear before the Beit Din. It's not a conversion, and they don't have to jump through some of the other hoops that people converting do, but they do have that formality of appearing before the Beit Din, really just telling their story, telling about their Jewish identity, and then three rabbis on the Beit Din sign the certificate stating that they're Jewish, affirming their Jewish status. Jonathan mentioned the essays. Our normal practice is that people who come to the Beit Din write 2 essays. There is a let out for one of the essays if people prefer to do an oral test on basic Jewish knowledge instead of the second essay. But the vast majority do write 2 essays, one about their journey to Judaism. It's called What Being Jewish Means to Me. And the other essay used to be quite prescribed as something on the Jewish festivals or the Jewish life cycle, but over recent years we've become much more open about the topic for the second essay. So very often now people research something of great interest to them. It might be the history of a Jewish community that they're ancestrally associated with, or some other topic. We've had a vast array of topics of Judaism and psychotherapy. It's one that pops into my head, Judaism and music. And it's something that people can get a sense of achievement of having researched and produced something. We have reduced the essays over the years. When I started out as a liberal rabbi, people had to write 5 essays, and I won't go into what they all had to be about. But many years ago, we felt that was a little bit over the top, and we've reduced it to the 2 essays. But a lot of our liberal rabbis feel that it is a very valuable part of the process, and one of the rabbis, at least, on the Beit Din will have read those essays before the person comes and will open the discussion at the Beit Din by talking about the essays, usually praising them, but also inviting further comment and discussion about that before we get on to other questions that the other 2 rabbis might want to ask. Hebrew reading. Yes, this is, as Jonathan mentioned, one of the points of difference. And in liberal Judaism, it's been our practice not to test people who come to the Beit Din on their reading. We expect that the sponsoring rabbi will have checked whether the person can read Hebrew to the required pretty basic standard to take part in services and follow what's going on and know the basic blessings. And there's a section on the form that people fill in that gives their Hebrew level. So we don't feel it necessary to test that at the Beit Din. I have to say, though, when I had the opportunity to sit in on a Reform Beit Din a few months ago, I was really impressed with the way in which the Hebrew reading bit was done. It wasn't as I had expected, that the Siddur is opened and they're told to read that paragraph, sight unseen, but instead the person is invited to prepare a passage beforehand, perhaps a prayer that they really like or a psalm that they really like, and then read a little bit of it. And so it can be quite an important experience for the person. So this is something that, as we discuss further, harmonization between our Batei Din is there for us to discuss. I want to say, I know there'll be lots of questions, so I'll stop in a minute. Just want to say a word about motives for conversion, which Jonathan spoke about very well. What I've gathered from Jonathan is that it's a fairly recent phenomenon within, for the Reform Beit Din, having a large percentage of people coming lishma, that is, converting purely out of their own personal love of Judaism and attraction to Judaism, rather than because they're marrying someone Jewish or have close Jewish ancestry. So in our liberal Beit Din, it's been our experience for quite some time, long before COVID, that many people find their spiritual path in Judaism. Speaking for a moment as a congregational rabbi rather than the chair of the Beit Din, particularly in my Edinburgh congregation, we've always had a really high percentage of people coming lishma, out of a love of Judaism. And as well as the motives that Jonathan mentioned, I think some of the other factors that I've noticed coming up very commonly over the years is people from quite a Christian background who were brought up in church, maybe going to Sunday school, and always found the idea of God attractive, but could never quite come to terms with the whole Jesus thing, the whole the Christian dogma bit about Jesus. A surprising number of people I find who believe in God in some way, and of course there are many ways of believing in God that are perfectly acceptable these days. But it's the Jesus bit that they never quite found convincing or believable. And many such people then at some point discover Judaism and find in it what they were looking for all along. I find that a very frequent motive. Another one, very paradoxically, is the Shoah. It's extraordinary how people who learn about the Shoah and about the sort of historic anti-Semitism and the persecution and the survival of the Jews find a deep resonance somewhere in their own souls with that story, and are fascinated by who are these people who have persisted and survived despite all of that. And this is something that, strangely enough, you might think it would repel people, but in fact, it often attracts people to Judaism. Some people come because they've had an encounter with Israel, either been on a holiday or volunteered on a kibbutz, although that maybe doesn't happen quite as much nowadays as it once did, or simply, learnt about Israel and all of the vitriol directed against Israel, and feel a powerful link, a powerful pull towards Israel and the Jewish people as a result. So these are only a few of the possible motives that people have, but I've noticed these ones coming up again and again with people in my congregations and in the Beit Din over many years. The point about the Jewish mother or the Jewish father, and if they're treated the same or differently. And I think I've already addressed that certainly in liberal Judaism, we try to treat them the same. It may happen sometimes that people with a Jewish mother, even without so much Jewish upbringing, are simply accepted as Jewish by the synagogue, by the rabbi, without ever coming to the Beit Din for an affirmation of Jewish status. But in principle, we treat people with Jewish sort of matrilineal and patrilineal alike. And interesting, there's precedent for that in ancient rabbinic discussions, but I won't go into those right now.
Do you get many people from Eastern Europe who simply don't know whether they're Jewish or not, or whose parents renounce Judaism? What is your attitude to that?
Yeah, we do. And if people have not got any documentation, we try and help them discover their Jewish roots in other ways. We'll ask them what their memory is of Jewish ceremonies. If not at home, then their grandparents. We'll ask for any affidavits that they got from a cousin and aunt. We'll go back to the grandparents' generations and see what's happened to their children and if they can give information. I mean, if people are mad enough to claim they're Jewish, then there has to be a really good reason, and we try and help people. And in fact, you've touched on something I was going to mention as well. We have some other certificates as well as conversion. We have a recognition certificate, which may apply to this sort of person, whereby they already have a Jewish identity and often a Jewish upbringing, but they can't actually prove they're Jewish. And if we are fairly convinced that they're telling the truth, then we won't issue a conversion, because you can't convert from Judaism to Judaism. You have to convert from outside Judaism to Judaism, and so we'll give them instead a recognition certificate which says, we recognize your Jewish status. And there's also, by the way, another one, which is a return certificate, which applies to people who maybe have got a great-grandparent who are Jewish, or even sometimes going back to a sort of Marano and Converso ancestry. Still, they have to do the full course, but we also give this return, indicating they're not coming from no Jewish connection, but they do have a Jewish link back in the day. So again, we try and just recognize people's identity. And as Mark was saying, in a sense, this increase in conversion is quite extraordinary now, given the anti-Semitism, the rising tensions of October 7th. So it's really counterintuitive that conversions seem to be rising. And we often forget, actually, that to the outside world, it's not, we're often seen as a very sort of enriching faith. And the sort of not just a belief in God without necessarily the Christian theology that goes with it, but the sense of community and camaraderie, and that's one of the big reasons that the people convert. They just like what we offer, and I think here Reform and Liberal, whereas the Orthodox are very suspicious and often put out barriers, we tend to say welcome. We treat conversions as a compliment, that they like what we have so much that they want to adopt it for themselves.
I knew a guy called Ian Ellel who was a converso, whose parents were conversos, but he believed that he's given the name Ellel because they wanted to keep that link and eventually come back again.
Yep. And we hear people who don't know why, but they always close the curtains on a Friday night and light candles, and they've done that apparently for centuries. And why do they do that? Well, it may be because they just like candles, but it also may have been a resonance of Marano times.
Is it true that the Reform Beit Din wear black robes like judges?
No.
Oh,
They wear whatever they wear, ordinary clothes. As it happens, I wear a PhD robe because we wanted to have a mixture of informality so people felt at ease, but also a certain formality because, we are it is a very momentous event, so we don't want to sort of wear schlocky stuff. And I'm the sort of, as the convener, the civil servant, if you like, and so therefore I have this sort of gown. But the other three rabbis on the court just wear ordinary clothes.
so that must have been what I'd heard about. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to say a word about that. I didn't include a little bit of the history, which is that in liberal Judaism, referring to the Beit Din is actually relatively recent, in the last 15 years or so. Throughout most of the history of liberal Judaism, it was called the Rabbinic Board, and deliberately didn't use the terminology of Beit Din, which is the Hebrew word for a court, a rabbinic court, and we've certainly never referred to it in English as a court, which I think is done sort of colloquially within the Reform movement. So we were always the Rabbinic Board, but as Hebrew terminology became more popular within the last decades, there was a bit of a push to use the Hebrew term Beit Din and put ourselves, as it were, on a sort of equal Jewish footing to the Reform Beit Din and other Batei Din in the progressive Jewish world. But we don't consider ourselves judges or constituting a court as such in any formal way. Michael Berkson asks, what does the liberal Judaism Beit Din do if both parents are Jewish and the child has had no Jewish upbringing? It's a really good question. The answer is we automatically treat anybody with two Jewish parents as Jewish. And they would never come to the Beit Din, because if the rabbi of the synagogue where they apply to join accepts that their parents were Jewish, then nothing further is required. You might think that's a bit illogical, since with someone with one Jewish parent, the upbringing also plays a role in determining whether we recognize the person as Jewish. But the way the rules evolved, it was always accepted that somebody with two Jewish parents, who therefore has never had any other sort of religious parental influence, as it were, other than Jewish, is automatically Jewish. You may ask, oh, what if parents had converted to another religion? That raises interesting questions. We would still accept the person as Jewish, but we might offer them, as we would with a person who had converted to another religion who wants to come back, we might offer them some ceremony of returning to Judaism within the synagogue context, but it wouldn't come to the Beit Din.
What happens if a disabled person has difficulty reading Hebrew or anything else that matter? We will always try and cater for the individual. I mean, you don't have to be disabled to find Hebrew difficult. There are some people who are just not academic at all, and who frankly find that learning Judaism is difficult. They're very happy participating in services and community, and so if they are, academically challenged, to put it politely, then we will also value something like sincerity and involvement and integrity. So those are equally part of what's going on. And as for the question of whether liberal and reform rabbis sit on each other's Beit Din, not at the moment. That's something actually that Mark and I have actually been discussing literally a few days ago. We have observed each other's courts, but we don't at the moment sit on them.
Hi. So it's sort of fascinating to hear. I did a conversion online, and certainly didn't get away with 2 essays. I think we probably had to write about 10, but I think our teaching rabbi was perhaps a hard taskmaster, or enjoyed reading our essays. I was going to ask that same question that you just touched on, Rabbi Jonathan, about how what would it take for a reform rabbi to sit on a liberal Beit Din at the moment, and vice versa? Would the conference and the assembly have to merge for that to happen? Or is it something that simply, having been ordained as a progressive rabbi, that you're able to switch across Batei Din?
No, at the moment, if you the liberal Beit Din is serviced by liberal rabbis and the reform by reform rabbis. But as we are in this sort of transitional period, Mark and I have been discussing making exceptional arrangements as an experiment. But it's a discussion stage. It hasn't reached actuality yet. Just to reinforce something that Mark said, but just to spell out that whereas the Orthodox have dayanim, in other words, set judges, and it's only 3 or 4 people who will sit on the court at any one time, Reform and liberal rabbis do it on a rota basis. So there's a sort of pot of 30 or 40 rabbis on each court. So we don't have permanent people, but everyone has a go, and everyone is usually a congregational rabbi, and therefore they know what it's like for the converts, and know what their experiences are.
Good evening to you both. What a very, very interesting conversation. I'm sure you both remember back in the 80s and the 90s when Jews for Jesus was a real problem for the community. I'm just wondering, particularly where there was concerns about getting into the community via the back door. I'm just wondering, is this a problem still for the Beit Din to sort of ensure sincerity, etc.?
We haven't experienced it as a big issue. I can't recall anyone with sort of messianic Christian beliefs coming to the Beit Din. I don't think they'd get that far, because they'd be sort of sussed out sooner than that by the sponsoring rabbi. We have occasionally had people who have come. I've had people who have come to me as a rabbi, whom I've realized have sort of not Jews for Jesus, but sort of Christian ideas, and have gently suggested to them that conversion through us is not the right path for them. What we have had, and this affected me very personally, it was connected with one of my congregations, is someone who was a former Messianic rabbi who, let's say, saw the error of his ways and decided to convert properly to Judaism and entirely give up the sort of Messianic Jewish sort of path, and is now a well accepted and very productive member of one of our congregations. So that's possible, but of course one has to be very sure that there isn't some attempt to infiltrate Messianic Christian ideas. But it hasn't generally come up as a problem or an issue as far as I'm aware.
I was just a question really to both of you around labels for when somebody's on their Jewish journey or returning to Judaism and they're going through the classes and you haven't quite been to the Beit Din yet and you've started living that full Jewish life, but you're not Jewish either. The reason I'm asking that is with recent instance at Glastonbury, I was called in to comment on something and I suddenly had a moment where I was like, I'm unable to comment as a Jew, but I can neither say I'm on a converting journey either. And I wasn't quite sure what my label or title was. All I could give was a response as me as an individual.
I think you gave the right response. You could say you're a prospective Jew, but just to say you're on the conversion course. And frankly, even once you're Jewish, we can only sometimes speak for ourselves, because to speak for all Jews is like, wow, impossible.
Yeah.
This isn't what you asked, but it goes on from there in terms of a status of a person in transition. We had a situation where somebody who was converting died, sadly, in the middle of it, unexpectedly. And the question was, could they have a Jewish funeral? And the answer was yes, because we recognize that they started a Jewish journey, and therefore again, it's a matter of being people friendly. We wanted to honor the path that they were on.
There's a couple of questions in the chat I thought would be quite interesting to ask. One is about circumcision. I think we mentioned mikveh before. Is circumcision required, and do you think it will carry on being required?
Well, certainly from the reform point of view, it's the default position. But like Mark said, there are exemptions. So if it's someone who will perhaps have physical difficulties. We had a gentleman came to the court literally today of 80. It wasn't probably sensible for him to have a circumcision. Or if there are mental or psychological problems or sexual issues, then providing they, chat to their sponsoring rabbi, we're very happy to accept an exemption on any of those grounds.
Yes, similar for us. The language within our liberal Jewish guidelines is that circumcision is strongly recommended. I believe personally in upholding the practice of circumcision, despite the reservations that Jennifer expressed in her question. I understand those, but I think circumcision is a valuable and important cultural and spiritual practice for Jews. We respect individuals, and for that matter, parents of baby boys who, in all conscience, for whatever reason, decide that circumcision is not right for them. And so we used to ask people coming to the Beit Din to have had a conversation with a doctor about it and get a doctor's note, as it were, sort of letting them off. But then we realized that most doctors in the UK now, because of the sort of medical fashion, are so anti-circumcision anyway that there was no serious discussion ever had. So we changed the requirement for people to go to one of our mohalim, one of our progressive mohalim, all of whom are, of course, physicians as well, and have a conversation with one of them, which many people did. But we have very few mohalim, and their valuable time isn't best spent by having long discussions with people who really don't want to be circumcised anyway. So we've kind of waived that requirement now, and it's really between the person and their sponsoring rabbi, who will then note for the Beit Din whether the person is or isn't circumcised. And people who do that, and lots of people still do very proudly and readily, will often attach the sort of documentary proof of that. But if it's something that wasn't done for some reason, it doesn't come up at the Beit Din typically.
I was an administrator of a conversion class, and there were some of the students, I couldn't wait for them to convert. They were just so interested and part of, but the majority of them seemed only to do it just to save a family row and to get married, and you never saw them again in any capacity ever again. And I wondered how, as a Beit Din, you are able to assess what sincerity is, or how do you know, or what your views are.
I'm not at all bothered by people like that. For two reasons. Firstly, if nothing else, they've gone through a year of education, and so has their partner. So it means that the household, which might have been totally lapsed, at least has got some Jewish knowledge. And it's much better that they have done that year, and the partner's also been involved, than if they hadn't. So I think we win anyway. I mean, I agree that obviously you want everyone who converts to be coming every week, and involved in the community. So yes, I agree that's the ideal. But we have to live with reality. And also, you could, a little bit tongue in cheek, but maybe seriously, say that people who become Jewish have the right to be like born Jews. Most of the born Jews come once a year. And therefore, until born Jews show a really good example of being 100% involved and coming every week, then we can't blame people who convert. And let's face it, a lot of people convert not necessarily for religious reasons, but for cultural or ethnic reasons, or even ethical reasons, and they still feel at home in Judaism. They. I mean, look at Judaism. I mean, most of our congregations are not. Most of our congregants are not worshippers, right? Which is why you have to have overflows once a year, because they don't come on ordinary Friday and Saturday, but they'll still be involved in other aspects. So I think that although ideally you want people who convert to be involved, the reality is as long as they come to something, whether it's being part Yom Kippur or part of CST, or coming to the annual dinner and dance, as long as they've got some connection, then I don't think it's been at all wasted. And as I say, you can't undo the education that they've gained.
Yeah, I'd just add that often people might vanish for a while after being married, but we hope that when they start having kids, they will come back maybe for a bris, baby naming, and ultimately children coming to the cheder and bar bat mitzvah. So yeah, we hope for that. But that's also part of the reason why I personally really like it when people have their own spiritual reasons for doing it, and show a sense of personal commitment, not just satisfying the family.
Now, I just want to second what Mark said. I think sometimes you have to play the long game, and the people who convert, when they're 26, might reappear when they're 36.